This is Gregory Rapp, writer, researcher, and podcaster, and you're listening to Air is Human, a regular podcast about American and global history, politics, and popular culture trends. To Air is Human began as a series of long-form writings I began penning over 5 years ago, during and a bit before the pandemic, which marked my first foray into nonfiction. By training, I'm a speculative fiction writer who has worked on short stories and novels without much in the way of progress, but I've spent the better half of a decade honing my craft as a writer, researcher, and storyteller. This episode before you of To Air is Human is a sort of introduction and a piece that has quite a bit of introspection attached to it. If you'd like to read the long-form essay that made this episode possible, consider checking out my newsletter of the same name. You can find this newsletter at www.toairishuman.xyz. In 2008, my great-grandmother, who was a woman known to strangers, friends, family, and community members as Mildred Rapp, died. She was born an Ackerman whose family headed out west to find their fortunes in Utah. Last year, 2024, was a year of ups and downs for me, both professionally and personally. Back in July 2024, I decided to leave a job at a college I worked for nearly 10 years. Throughout the year, I had struggled with my mental and physical health. When things were beginning to look grim professionally and personally, opportunities began opening up, many of which had been closed off due to my previous employment situation. Others came after reaching out to the right folks for the umpteenth time. And it was during these ups and downs, these so-called trials and tribulations, that I remembered that old woman, long since dead and buried, who lived as our fragile family's matriarch. Again, her name was Mildred Rapp, who we all knew as Midge, or more respectfully, Grandma Midge. Grandma Midge was not my grandmother, but rather my father's grandmother. She was, technically speaking, my great-grandmother, who lived a long, full life, one with its own trials and tribulations, ups and downs. Grandma Midge was a strong-willed and opinionated old woman who enjoyed watching reruns of old television game shows while working on her crosswords, reading the occasional newspaper, or chatting with her grandkids, my uncle and father, or her great-grandkids would be me, my brother, and my sister. She also loved to play cards. Her favorites included bridge and skip-bo, and she cheated whenever she got the chance, something few people called her on in her old age. My grandma Midge saw one hell of a life between the year she was born, 1917, and the year she died, 2008. While she has since gone home to see her husband Carl and her young daughter Annie, she can still be felt in my life today, even when I don't realize it. I'd never really understood the implications of this old woman's life and what it meant. I'd always taken for granted having a great-grandparent in my life, someone who dispensed weird wisdom, always paid using cash and coin, and never cried in front of anyone. What I didn't know was that few kids of my generation grew up with this reality. Most knew their grandparents, yes, but few, if any, knew their great-grandparents. I had been lucky enough to know Grandma Midge's husband Carl before he passed as well. Sadly, he had had a stroke years before, making it hard to communicate with him outside the usual gestures and offerings of milkshakes and food. I'd also been lucky to know Grandma Midge, who came to live in southern Colorado, where we all lived at the time, back in the late 1990s. When I was reintroduced to Great-Grandma Midge, I didn't think much of her. She was kind of funny looking with her ghost white hair, her big glasses, and her stooped back. She wasn't very friendly either, and she expected kids to be seen and not heard, and occasionally not seen and not heard. This toughness faded with time, and the person she was became more apparent. Grandma Midge was born in Utah, a newly minted state at the time. Her family, which included 11 brothers and sisters, was chasing what may have been the sugar beet rush out in Utah, hoping to make a quick buck and a comfortable life for themselves. The Deseret News ran an article on the prominence of sugar beets in the state back in the 1890s and early 20th century. If you're interested, you can find it using Google. When my grandma Midge was born in 1917, she and her family lived in a house of modest means, without amenities we'd usually associate with modern housing, such as electricity, running water, and even gas. I remember Grandma Midge telling me how things were when she was younger, and she always talked about how things had come so far in her lifetime. Her father, for various reasons, moved the family back to Illinois, and she spent the remainder of her adult life there. Grandma Midge graduated from high school, having studied bookkeeping, which she did until after the Second World War. Grandma Midge worked for the Soviet government, ironically, during the war, serving as a sort of bean counter for the Soviets, ordering much-needed American supplies and materials. She even claimed to know 2 words in Russian, da and niet, or yes and no. During the war, her husband, Carl, served on the West Coast. They wrote letters to one another, and she shared these letters with me, the only great-grandkid who wanted to hear her story, or so she complained. After the war, things got a bit murky for Grandma's memories. She didn't talk much about them. Certain details slipped her mind, and she didn't care for them, or they were filled with memories of her little adopted daughter who died at a young age. When I began working through these memories years ago, I sorted out the events this woman lived through and survived. She saw the Soviets turn into the big boogeymen, she watched NASA put men on the moon, and she saw the country change in terms of population and development and fall into a new paradigm where the United States wasn't the dominant economic giant it had been. She watched the great motor city and others like it rot from within. She saw new racial and gender revolutions unfold, and she watched the world change ever so quickly before her eyes. She lived through the greatest peace in human history, and she saw the greatest expansion of wealth and development worldwide, often from the comfort of her home and recliner. By the time Grandma Midge passed, she had grown accustomed to life unknown to her family when she was born in 1917. She lived in a well-heated home with working gas and electricity and water. She owned a flat-screen color television, and she watched her favorite musicals such as The Sound of Music and the animated hit Shrek on DVDs she bought from some big box store. The internet was hitting its stride, and the world was promising to head into another era of rapid change and utter madness. The world Grandma Midge left behind was a different place than the one she entered in 1917. It is this kind of storytelling, with its explorations of world and American pop culture trends, history, and politics that To Err Is Human will provide readers and listeners regularly. If this project interests you, you can support it by sharing this podcast and its associated newsletter with friends, family members, your neighborhood cats, or even work colleagues. Thank you for listening. Until next time.